Keanu sat by the window, gazing out at the night sky, the hum of the plane's engines lulling him into a sense of calm. He wasn't supposed to be here. A quiet flight, no press, no cameras, just a break from the constant noise of being Keanu Reeves. It had been weeks since he'd had a moment to himself, a chance to sit in silence without the world's expectations pressing against him. It wasn't that he didn't love his fans or the recognition, it was just that sometimes he longed for peace. As the flight progressed, Keanu's thoughts wandered. He had always been the type to keep to himself, a shadow behind the star, known for his humility and kindness. But there was something more hidden beneath the surface. Something he tried to forget. His past, his abilities, and the darkness that still haunted him. There were days when he could almost forget that part of him, the part that knew things he didn't want to know. Things that came to him in dreams, whispers, and sometimes even in waking hours. He buried it all, pretending to be just another man living a normal life. But the truth was he wasn't. The flight attendants moved down the aisle, offering drinks and snacks to the passengers, while a quiet murmur of conversation filled the cabin. Keanu adjusted his seat, feeling the subtle pressure of the air as it shifted within the plane. His eyes flicked over the passengers around him, noting the faces, the unspoken stories they carried. There was a woman with a child, her face marked by fatigue, likely a single mother traveling on her own. A businessman sat across the aisle, engrossed in his phone, a furrowed brow giving away his frustration with some work issue. And then, there was the man in the back, eyes scanning the cabin, his demeanor off, too alert, too watchful. Keanu's instincts tingled, and a shiver ran down his spine. Keanu didn't like to admit it, but he could sense things. It wasn't something he'd asked for, but it was something he couldn't ignore. The man in the back was dangerous. There was an energy about him that wasn't right. Keanu's pulse quickened as he focused on the man, trying to make sense of the feeling. It was then that the man's eyes met his. A brief moment of contact, and Keanu saw it, something dark, something cold behind those eyes. His stomach churned. The man turned away quickly, shifting in his seat as if he hadn't noticed the brief exchange. But Keanu's mind raced. He'd seen enough in his life to know when something wasn't right. It was the same feeling he had gotten on set sometimes, when he was playing a character who had to confront a villain, when the atmosphere would shift, and the air would grow heavy with tension. But this wasn't a movie, and he wasn't acting. He was real, sitting in a plane, with real people around him. The reality of the situation began to set in. The flight continued, but Keanu couldn't shake the sense of unease that had settled over him. It wasn't just the man, it was the growing weight in the air. Something was wrong. The hum of the engine seemed to falter for a moment, a strange, unsettling pause that echoed through the cabin. And then the lights flickered, dimming momentarily before returning to their usual brightness. The passengers barely reacted, too absorbed in their own worlds to notice. But Keanu did. He felt it then, the presence. Something intangible but undeniably there. The temperature dropped, and a cold draft swept through the cabin. The woman with the child hugged her son closer, and the businessman's phone suddenly died, the screen going black in an instant. A soft whisper floated through the air, and Keanu's heart skipped a beat. It was a voice, faint, as if carried by the wind. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was calling to him. Keanu stood up, moving towards the back of the plane, where the unsettling man had been sitting. The passengers around him barely noticed, their attention still focused on their own distractions. But as Keanu passed, his hand brushed against the arm of a woman, and she shuddered, her eyes wide with a sudden, inexplicable fear. Keanu's senses flared. The air was thick with an unseen presence, something ancient, something malicious. When he reached the back, the man was gone. The seat was empty, his belongings still scattered across the table. Keanu's eyes scanned the space, his instincts screaming at him to act. He moved quickly, ducking into the galley where the flight attendants were still going about their duties. But their calm demeanor was deceiving. They, too, seemed to sense something wrong, but they kept their composure, as if trained to remain unshaken in the face of the unknown. Suddenly, the plane jolted, a sharp turbulence that caused the passengers to gasp and grab onto their armrests. The overhead compartments rattled, and Keanu's heart pounded in his chest. He rushed back to his seat, his mind racing. There was no denying it anymore. The plane was in danger. The man had done something, summoned something Keanu knew all too well. It was an entity, a being from beyond the physical realm, something that thrived on fear, on chaos. As the plane shook, Keanu's thoughts raced back to his past, to the things he had tried so hard to forget. The training, the experiences, the knowledge of things most people couldn't even comprehend. He had pushed it all away, but now it was back, creeping into his consciousness, demanding his attention. He was no longer just Keanu Reeves, the actor. He was something more, and whether he liked it or not, he was the one who had to stop this. The flight attendants were starting to panic now, their calm facades cracking as they realized that the situation was spiraling out of control. Keanu's mind raced. The entity wasn't just haunting the plane, it was feeding on the terror, the confusion, the helplessness of the passengers. He had to act. He couldn't wait any longer. The entity was here, and Keanu Reeves was the only one who could stop it. The entity's presence became undeniable. Every moment that passed seemed to heighten the sense of dread filling the cabin. The air grew colder, a chill that cut through the fabric of Keanu's jacket, as if the temperature itself was being sucked into an unseen vortex. The low hum of the engines morphed into a distorted sound, as though the plane was no longer part of the world it had once been a part of. A deep, unnerving silence fell over the cabin, broken only by the occasional, nervous murmur from the passengers. Keanu's senses were on high alert. His eyes darted around the cabin, looking for any signs of movement or unnatural behavior. There, at the rear of the plane, a figure seemed to flicker in and out of focus. A shadow, just at the edge of perception. The longer he looked, the clearer it became. The man was back, but he wasn't the same. His form seemed translucent, shifting like a wisp of smoke, his features almost indistinguishable, save for the cold, malicious gleam in his eyes. Keanu's heart raced, and a sudden surge of panic clawed at his chest. This was no longer a fight with a simple threat. This was something far darker, something that preyed on the souls of the innocent. He had seen glimpses of such things before, fleeting moments in the corners of his mind, but this was real. This was happening. And it was up to him to stop it. Taking a deep breath, Keanu moved swiftly down the aisle, pushing past passengers who were now on edge, murmuring in fear as the disturbance in the air grew stronger. He reached the galley, where the flight attendants were gathered, their faces pale, their hands trembling as they tried to make sense of the chaos. Keanu didn't have time for questions, for explanations. He had to act. One of the attendants turned to him, her voice barely a whisper. "What's going on? What's happening to the plane?" she asked, her eyes wide with a mix of confusion and terror. Keanu shook his head, urgency in his voice. "It's not the plane," he said. "It's something else. Something we can't see, but it's here. And it's after us." Her eyes widened, and she took a step back. "What do you mean, something else? What can we do?" Keanu didn't have an answer. He had no choice but to rely on the instincts he had spent years trying to suppress. His mind flashed back to his training, the cryptic teachings from his past, and the encounters with forces far beyond the understanding of normal men. He had to reach into that part of himself, the part that he hated and feared, the part that connected him to the supernatural, to the things that no one else could see. His hands trembled slightly, and a dark weight pressed against his chest. He could feel the entity's pull, the way it drained the energy from the very air around him. It was trying to manipulate his thoughts, to weaken his resolve. But Keanu was no stranger to struggle. He had fought for so long to maintain control over his abilities, but now, in this moment, there was no choice but to embrace them. Closing his eyes, Keanu focused, calling upon the power that had once terrified him. He felt the surge of energy, a quiet hum at first, then a roaring tide. His connection to the unseen world sharpened. He could feel the entity's presence now, its malignant force thrumming against his mind, trying to break through his defenses. It was close. Too close. And then, just like that, he saw it. The thing that had been haunting the plane, a spectral entity, a manifestation of pure malevolence. It had no form, only a presence, a force of destruction that fed on fear, on chaos. The entity's power was overwhelming, and Keanu could feel his grip on reality beginning to slip. But he had no choice. He had to fight. He reached deep within himself, tapping into a well of strength he hadn't touched in years, a strength forged in the fires of his darkest moments. With a forceful will, Keanu pushed back, attempting to establish a barrier between himself and the entity. The plane jolted again, this time with a force that sent several passengers tumbling from their seats. Screams echoed through the cabin, the terror palpable. The lights flickered and dimmed, casting the cabin in an eerie half-light. Keanu's grip tightened, his eyes snapping open. He wasn't going to let this entity win. He couldn't. Through the chaos, Keanu's voice broke the silence. "Everyone, stay calm," he shouted, his voice authoritative and clear. "Do not panic. Keep calm, and listen to me." The passengers looked to him, their expressions a mix of confusion and hope. For a moment, he saw the disbelief in their eyes, but then, perhaps it was the air of command in his voice, or perhaps the palpable aura of determination surrounding him, but they began to listen. Some of them still clung to their fear, but Keanu could feel their attention shifting, their hope growing. The flight attendants moved to assist, trying to reassure the passengers. But the entity was still there, its presence looming like a dark cloud, and Keanu knew that the real battle had just begun. The world around him seemed to warp and shift as he faced the malevolent force. He could feel the weight of the responsibility settling on his shoulders, the burden of knowing that he was the only one who could stop this. He had to confront the darkness, not just for himself, but for everyone on board. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what came next. He was no longer the actor, no longer the man people saw in the media. He was something more, a reluctant hero, a medium, a man who had walked through the shadows of his own past and now had to confront the shadows of the world. There was no turning back. The entity's influence pressed harder against him, but Keanu's resolve remained strong. He could feel its energy trying to invade his mind, to break him down, but he wouldn't let it. This was the moment he had been training for, the moment when everything he had repressed, everything he had ignored, would come to the forefront. With a sharp exhale, Keanu focused all his energy on the entity, reaching out with his mind, pushing through the darkness. He could feel it waver for a moment, a flicker of hesitation, but then it surged back, stronger than before. It wasn't going to be easy, but Keanu knew that he had no choice. He had to face it, and he had to win. "Not today," he whispered under his breath. "Not today." The plane buckled under the force of the entity's presence. Keanu could feel the walls of the cabin groan, as though the very structure of the aircraft was being stretched and strained by the unseen force. The unnatural chill in the air intensified, and the murmur of passengers rose into a cacophony of fear. Some were praying, others were crying, and a few had completely given in to panic, thrashing in their seats. Yet in the midst of the chaos, Keanu remained calm, though his mind was racing, formulating his next move. His body was shaking from the exertion of channeling the energy required to combat the entity. His hand trembled as he pressed it against the cold metal armrest, grounding himself in the midst of the storm. The world felt increasingly distant, slipping into a place where time itself seemed to lose its meaning. He was walking the razor-thin line between control and chaos, and it took all of his mental discipline to keep himself from succumbing to the pull of the supernatural force that was now tormenting the plane. Every fiber of Keanu's being screamed at him to run, to escape, but he couldn't. Not this time. He was the only one who could stop it. His past, the things he had hidden for so long, had prepared him for this moment. The memories of the things he had encountered, the lessons he had learned, all led to this confrontation. He had spent years suppressing his gifts, shunning the knowledge that came with them, but now, he had no choice but to embrace them. The fate of everyone aboard depended on him. The entity's power fluctuated, as though it was testing his resolve. It lashed out again, a sudden, searing wave of cold that nearly took his breath away. Keanu staggered, but he did not fall. The pressure in his head increased, the sensation of being torn apart from within threatening to consume him. The entity wasn't just a force of destruction, it was a parasite, feeding off the fear, the despair, the desperation of the people around him. It thrived on the chaos it sowed. Keanu's vision blurred, his senses overloaded, but amidst the fog of confusion, he saw the entity clearly now. It was no longer just a vague, shifting shadow. It had taken form, a monstrous, writhing mass of darkness, its features still too amorphous to fully comprehend but undeniably terrifying in its intent. It was a predator, and the passengers were its prey. The terror in the air was palpable, each heartbeat a drumbeat that echoed through the very core of the plane. He could feel it trying to reach him, trying to slip inside his mind, to use his own fears against him. It whispered, soft and insidious, planting seeds of doubt, reminding him of his darkest moments. The guilt. The mistakes. The pain of the life he had lived before this. But Keanu refused to listen. He had faced worse demons, both literal and metaphorical, and he wasn't going to let this one break him. He had come too far. Steeling himself, Keanu began to focus on the one thing that could counter the entity: light. Pure, untainted light. His mind reached out, seeking the warmth of a power greater than the darkness that threatened to overrun him. In the depths of his soul, he found it, a light so bright that it cut through the fog of fear and despair, a light born not of the sun, but of his will. His resolve. With a deep breath, Keanu released the energy he had been holding back, unleashing the full force of his abilities. The air around him shimmered, and for a brief moment, he could see the light flickering into existence, glowing like a beacon in the midst of the void. The entity recoiled, its form flickering as it tried to escape the light's reach. Keanu could feel its resistance, but it was weak, a mere shadow against the intensity of his will. The light surged forward, a wave of energy that washed over the cabin. The passengers gasped as the temperature in the plane began to stabilize, the unnatural chill lifting for the first time since the disturbance began. The entity howled, a shrill sound that reverberated through the very walls of the aircraft, but it could not withstand the purity of Keanu's power. It began to unravel, its form collapsing in on itself as if it had no substance left to hold it together. Keanu knew this was not the end, but it was a victory, however brief. But even as the entity faded, Keanu knew it wasn't gone. It was only retreating, waiting for an opportunity to strike again. He had pushed it back, but there was still a long fight ahead. He turned to face the passengers, his voice steady despite the weight of what he had just experienced. "Stay calm," he said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "It's not over, but we have time. I need you all to listen to me. We have to stay together." His words seemed to carry a power of their own, resonating in the hearts of those who heard them. For the first time since the entity's appearance, the passengers seemed to regain some semblance of control over their fear. They looked to him, not as a stranger, not as an actor, but as someone who had the strength to lead them through this nightmare. In their eyes, Keanu saw a flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Keanu quickly began to direct the flight attendants, instructing them to help keep the passengers calm and prevent anyone from doing something reckless in the panic. He moved through the cabin, his mind still racing, trying to figure out his next move. The entity wasn't gone, and it was only a matter of time before it returned, stronger than before. But for now, they had a fragile peace, and that was all he could offer. As Keanu continued to assess the situation, he realized that this wasn't just about saving the plane. This was about redemption. For all the mistakes he had made in his past, for the darkness that had followed him for so long, this was his chance to make things right. He had never asked for this burden, but now that it was upon him, he would carry it. He would fight, not just for the passengers, but for his own soul. And in that moment, Keanu understood. This wasn't just a battle against a supernatural entity. This was a battle against everything he had once feared, his own demons, his own weaknesses, and the belief that he wasn't enough. He was enough. And he would prove it. The lights flickered again, and the temperature in the cabin dropped. The entity was returning. Keanu could feel it. But this time, he was ready. The turbulence intensified as the entity made its presence known once again. The temperature dropped sharply, and the lights flickered, casting eerie shadows across the cabin. The passengers, already on edge, grew frantic. Some screamed, while others whispered prayers, hoping for a miracle. In the midst of the chaos, Keanu's mind was locked in focus. He could feel the entity circling, testing his resolve. This time, it was not just a force of darkness, it had learned from their previous encounter. It was adapting, growing more dangerous by the second. Keanu closed his eyes, tuning out the noise around him. His senses sharpened, and he reached into the depths of his being, searching for the source of his strength. His past was filled with regret, with mistakes and broken relationships, but he had also learned something through all of it: resilience. The things he had faced, his darkest moments, his failures, had shaped him, but they had not broken him. This entity, this force, was no different. It was a reflection of all the fear, all the pain, that he had carried for so long. And now, it was time to face it. He exhaled slowly, gathering his energy. He had to push harder this time. The entity was feeding off the fear in the cabin, growing stronger with each passing second. Keanu could feel the weight of its presence, like a crushing force pressing down on him, trying to drive him into submission. But he was not going to give in. Not this time. The entity's presence swelled, taking shape once again, this time more distinct, more solid. Its form was a twisted amalgamation of dark, shifting shadows, with eyes that burned like fire, glowing with malice. The passengers were frozen in terror, their eyes wide with fear, too paralyzed to move. Keanu knew he had to act quickly. If he didn't, the entity would break them all. He stood, the power inside him surging as he took a step forward, pushing back the creeping darkness. His body trembled from the effort, but he didn't let it slow him down. The weight of the air around him felt suffocating, and yet, Keanu forced himself to stay calm. He had learned long ago that fear was the enemy. And in this moment, he had to be the hero. The air crackled with energy as Keanu reached out with his mind, locking eyes with the entity. The darkness recoiled, sensing his resolve. But it was too late. Keanu tapped into the light within him, his own inner strength, and unleashed a wave of energy so powerful that it pushed the entity back, sending it crashing against the walls of the cabin. The force of the blow rattled the entire plane, causing the passengers to scream and brace themselves. But Keanu wasn't finished. The entity writhed, trying to regain control, but Keanu's will was stronger now. He focused, channeling every ounce of his energy into the confrontation. He could feel the energy pulsing through him, like a river rushing to flood a dam. He would not let it take hold again. The entity shrieked, a horrifying sound that sent chills down Keanu's spine. Its form distorted and stretched, trying to form a shape that could overpower him, but Keanu wasn't afraid. He was determined. He was the one in control now. He pushed harder, forcing the entity to shrink, to lose its grip on the cabin. The shadows that had once surrounded them began to dissipate, pulled into the vortex of light Keanu had created. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the entity was gone. The temperature in the cabin returned to normal, and the lights flickered back on. The plane stabilized, the turbulence calming. Silence filled the cabin, and for a moment, it felt as though nothing had ever happened. But Keanu knew better. He had won this battle, but the war was far from over. The entity was still out there, lurking, waiting for its chance to strike again. Keanu's heart pounded in his chest as he stood in the center of the cabin, his energy spent. His body was weak, but his mind was clear. He had saved them. But at what cost? The darkness within him was still there, lurking beneath the surface. He had fought the entity, but in doing so, he had also confronted his own demons. The things he had buried for so long had resurfaced, and he knew that he couldn't keep running from them. He had to face them, just as he had faced the entity. He looked around the cabin, meeting the eyes of the passengers who had witnessed the confrontation. There was fear in their eyes, but also something else. Something like gratitude. They had seen him fight, seen him stand tall in the face of unimaginable terror. And in that moment, Keanu realized something important. Heroism wasn't about never feeling fear. It was about acting despite it. It was about finding the strength to keep going, even when the world seemed to be falling apart. He had saved them this time, but there would be more challenges ahead. The entity was not the only force he had to contend with. There was a deeper darkness within him, one that could be just as dangerous as the supernatural force that had terrorized the flight. But Keanu was no longer afraid to face it. He had learned that the only way to conquer the darkness was to embrace the light. And in that light, he would find the strength to keep fighting. As the plane continued its journey, Keanu sat quietly, his mind still racing. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain: he was no longer the man he had been. The darkness, the fear, the guilt, none of it could control him anymore. He had found something stronger. And in that strength, he would find redemption. Keanu's senses were on high alert as the aftermath of the battle settled into a tense quiet. The passengers around him still trembled, unsure whether the terror had truly passed or if it was merely biding its time. Their eyes darted nervously, searching for signs that the worst was over. They couldn't know what Keanu knew: this wasn't over. Not yet. The entity had been driven back, but its grip on the plane, on their collective fear, still lingered like a shadow. Keanu could feel it, just beneath the surface, a reminder that evil does not relinquish control easily. He took a deep breath, his body still aching from the toll of the encounter. The energy it had taken to confront the entity had drained him more than he had expected, but there was no time for weakness. He had to stay vigilant. If the entity wasn't gone, it would come again. Keanu couldn't let his guard down, not even for a moment. The flight attendant approached him hesitantly, her voice shaky as she asked, Is it safe?" Keanu met her gaze, feeling the weight of the question. Was it truly safe? Could he assure her, and the rest of the passengers, that the danger had passed? He didn't know. But he couldn't let them see his doubt. He had to be the anchor in this storm. He forced a reassuring smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "We're all right. But we need to stay calm." His words, while intended to comfort, felt hollow. What did it mean to stay calm when the world around you seemed to defy all logic and reason? How could anyone feel safe knowing that something as ancient and malevolent as the entity could still be lurking, waiting for the right moment to strike again? As Keanu's mind raced, his thoughts kept drifting back to his past. The darkness within him, the guilt, the unresolved pain, was something that he had buried for years. He had tried to outrun it, tried to drown it in work, in distractions, in anything that could keep him from facing it. But now, in the face of this supernatural terror, it had resurfaced. The fight against the entity had been as much an internal struggle as it had been an external one. Keanu had spent so long convincing himself that he wasn't worthy of redemption, that he wasn't capable of making up for the mistakes of his past. But now, with the lives of these strangers in his hands, he realized that redemption wasn't about the past, it was about what you did in the moment. It was about choosing to be better, even when it seemed impossible. And right now, he had to choose. He had to choose to stay strong, to lead, even if it meant facing the parts of himself that he had long tried to forget. His thoughts were interrupted as the intercom crackled to life, the captain's voice filling the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've encountered some unexpected turbulence. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened as we continue our journey. We apologize for the inconvenience, and we will keep you updated." Keanu listened carefully, knowing the captain was unaware of the true cause of the chaos they had just endured. There was no mention of the entity, no acknowledgement of the supernatural forces that had nearly taken control of the flight. And that was how it had to be. If the passengers knew the truth, if they understood what had really happened, they might never feel safe again. They might never trust the skies. But Keanu knew the truth, and the truth was that the battle wasn't over. The entity had been forced back, yes, but it hadn't been destroyed. It had merely retreated, waiting for another chance to strike. Keanu had felt its presence, sensed its hunger. And he knew that the only way to stop it was to confront it again, to face it head-on with everything he had. He looked around the cabin, his eyes scanning the faces of the passengers. They were still on edge, but the terror in their eyes had begun to fade, replaced by a quiet, tentative hope. They had seen something they couldn't explain, something that defied logic. But in their hearts, they knew they had been spared. They had been saved. And though they might not understand how, they felt gratitude toward the man who had stood up to the entity, who had fought against the darkness when they had all been too scared to do so. Keanu's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, but one thing stood out above all: he couldn't let them down. He couldn't let the entity win, not after everything he had fought for. He had to stay strong, for them and for himself. His past, his guilt, his struggles, they couldn't define him anymore. What mattered now was the fight ahead. What mattered now was the future. As the flight continued on its course, Keanu resolved to confront the entity once more, to finish what had been started. He knew that the odds were against him, but he was no stranger to impossible odds. He had faced darkness before, in many forms. This time, though, he would not face it alone. The passengers, though unaware of the full scope of what was happening, had witnessed his strength. They had seen him stand tall in the face of terror. And that was something they could hold on to. That was something they could believe in. Keanu stood from his seat, his mind made up. He had been given a second chance, not just for the passengers, but for himself. He wasn't going to waste it. As the entity circled again, as the pressure mounted and the darkness closed in once more, Keanu steeled himself. This was his fight. And he would see it through. For them. For himself. For redemption. Keanu's thoughts remained sharp as the plane continued to hum through the air, yet the air felt thick with an oppressive weight. There was no denying the entity was still out there, lurking in the depths of the plane, waiting for its next opportunity. The quiet, seemingly calm atmosphere was nothing more than a fragile veneer, and Keanu knew it could shatter at any moment. He was ready. In truth, he had been ready for years, ever since his ability had awakened, dragging him into a world he had tried so hard to ignore. The weight of that knowledge was both a burden and a strength. He wasn't just confronting a supernatural entity, he was facing himself. The darkness that had once consumed him, guilt, regret, fear, was the same darkness that fed this malevolent force. He had never been able to outrun it, not completely. But now, he would confront it head-on. He would face the terror that had been festering inside of him, just as he had to face the entity that stalked the plane. He could hear the soft murmur of the passengers around him, their voices trembling with fear and uncertainty. They didn't know what was coming, but Keanu did. He had always known. The entity had fed on their fear before, and it would do so again. The only way to stop it was to take control of the fear, to take control of the situation, and to do so without hesitation. The entity had learned from their previous encounters. It was no longer just a shadow in the dark. It was an intelligence, an awareness, capable of adapting to Keanu's every move. That made it far more dangerous. But it also made it more predictable. Keanu had already encountered it in different forms, and he understood its patterns. It wasn't invincible. It was a force, a manifestation of everything dark and twisted, but even the most malevolent forces had weaknesses. Keanu could feel the entity drawing closer now. It wasn't just a presence. It was beginning to materialize again, taking shape in the shadows of the cabin. The temperature dropped once more, and the lights flickered ominously. Passengers began to panic, some of them looking for escape routes that didn't exist, others frozen in place, paralyzed by the same fear that had overtaken them earlier. Keanu's heart pounded in his chest as he stood and moved toward the center of the cabin, where the dark form began to coalesce. The air around him felt heavier, thick with a malevolent energy that threatened to crush him. But he stood firm. He could feel the tug of something deep inside, something he had repressed for so long, the pull of his own latent power. He had fought it for years, convinced that his abilities were a curse, that they had led him to places he didn't want to go. But now, in this moment, he understood. His power wasn't a curse. It was the key to defeating the entity, to saving these people. The entity's shape grew more defined, its form now fully visible in the shadows. It was tall, a silhouette of darkness, with eyes that gleamed like red-hot embers. Its presence filled the space, suffocating the air, threatening to pull Keanu into the void with it. But Keanu refused to be consumed. He had faced his demons before, and he wouldn't let this one take him down. He focused, drawing on the energy that had always been within him but had never fully manifested. His hands trembled as the power surged, filling him with a warmth that contrasted the cold, suffocating presence of the entity. His eyes locked onto the entity's form, and he spoke with the clarity and strength he had never thought himself capable of before. "You don't control me," he said, his voice steady and firm. "You don't control them." The entity recoiled, its form wavering as if unsure of how to respond to this new level of resistance. It had always fed off fear that Keanu had kept hidden for so long. But now, there was no fear. There was only resolve. And as Keanu's will grew stronger, so did the light within him. He raised his hands, his fingers glowing with an ethereal energy, and directed it at the entity. The force of his power collided with the entity's dark form, creating a shockwave that sent ripples through the air. The entity shrieked, a sound that reverberated in the cabin, shaking the walls and rattling the windows. It was a cry of frustration, of fury, but Keanu held his ground. He could feel it weakening, its hold on the passengers faltering. The dark shadows that had once filled the space began to dissipate, retreating as the entity struggled to maintain its form. Keanu pushed harder, pouring everything he had into the attack. The entity twisted and writhed in pain, but it was not enough to stop it. It fought back with a ferocity that took Keanu by surprise. The temperature in the cabin plummeted once more, and the lights flickered violently, threatening to plunge them all into darkness. The entity was not done yet, but Keanu had already made up his mind. He was not going to lose. He summoned the last of his strength, reaching deep into the core of his being, and unleashed a final blast of energy. The impact was devastating, causing the entire plane to shudder as though it were about to break apart. The entity let out a final, blood-curdling scream before it collapsed, its form disintegrating into the air like smoke. Keanu fell to his knees, exhausted, his body trembling from the effort. The passengers around him were still, silent in the aftermath. It was over. The entity was gone. But Keanu knew this wasn't the end. It had been a victory, yes, but a small one. The battle against the darkness, both external and internal, would continue. But for now, he had done what he came here to do. He had saved them. The passengers slowly began to stir, some moving toward him in a daze, others simply staring in disbelief. There were no words, no grand declarations of gratitude. But in their eyes, Keanu saw something. Something that spoke louder than words ever could. They had witnessed a hero, someone who had stood against the darkness without fear. And in that, they had seen a reflection of their own potential. Keanu didn't need their thanks. He didn't need anything but the knowledge that he had done what was right. That was enough. As the plane continued its journey, Keanu leaned back in his seat, letting the weight of the moment settle over him. He had faced the entity, faced his own fears, and emerged victorious. The darkness had been pushed back, but it wasn't gone for good. It would always be there, lurking in the shadows. But now, Keanu knew he had the strength to face it again. And again. And again. As the plane continued to glide through the clouds, a sense of eerie calm settled over the cabin, broken only by the muffled hum of the engines. Keanu's body was still heavy with the after-effects of this supernatural battle. His heart rate was slow but steady, and every muscle in his body ached, a constant reminder of the extraordinary force he had just confronted. The battle had drained him in ways he hadn't anticipated, but there was also something different in the air. The oppressive presence that had haunted the plane was gone, its malevolent energy completely erased. But as Keanu sat, breathing deeply, he couldn't shake the feeling that the entity's defeat wasn't the true victory. He had done what he had to do, but in doing so, he had uncovered something deeper within himself, something buried beneath the guilt, the darkness, and the memories he had tried so desperately to suppress. The struggle against the entity had mirrored his internal struggle. His power wasn't just a means to fight the supernatural. It was a part of him that he could no longer deny. The calm was brief, and soon, passengers began to stir from their shocked stupor. Whispers filled the cabin, voices trembling with awe, confusion, and disbelief. They had witnessed the impossible. They had witnessed a hero in action, but they hadn't understood the full weight of the situation. Keanu could see it in their eyes, the mixture of gratitude and fear. They knew something had changed, but they didn't know what. They didn't know who Keanu truly was or what had led him to this moment. Keanu closed his eyes for a moment, allowing himself the luxury of silence. He was grateful for the peace, but he knew the repercussions of the battle were far from over. The entity was gone, but there would always be other forces, other shadows lurking in the corners of the world. His powers weren't just meant to confront darkness, they were meant to keep it at bay, to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. It was a burden that would follow him, no matter how far he ran from it. He had come to terms with his abilities long ago, or so he thought. But the events of the flight had brought a harsh realization. His past could no longer be hidden behind the facade of a normal life. The fight with the entity had forced him to face not only his supernatural power but the darkness inside of him, the same darkness that had once made him fear the full extent of his abilities. The passengers, slowly regaining their composure, continued to whisper amongst themselves. Keanu knew they had questions, but he also knew they wouldn't ask. What could they possibly say? How could they comprehend what had just occurred? Some would likely chalk it up to adrenaline or mass hysteria, trying to explain away the unexplainable. But others, those who had witnessed the energy, the glow in his hands, the way the entity had dissolved into nothingness, would know the truth. In their eyes, Keanu was a savior. To them, he had stepped into the role of a hero without hesitation, facing something none of them could even comprehend. They had seen him rise up, confront the terror, and take control of the situation. But Keanu understood that the title of hero was fleeting. Today, it was his. Tomorrow, someone else would be called to face a different threat, one that required courage and sacrifice. There was no permanence in being a hero. It was a role defined by action, not title. But for the first time in years, Keanu felt something stir inside him, a sense of clarity that had long eluded him. It wasn't about the recognition or the accolades. It was about the fight itself. It was about choosing to step into the unknown, despite the fears that threatened to swallow him whole. It was about taking responsibility, not just for the battle against the supernatural, but for the fight against his own internal demons. The thought was unsettling. Responsibility. It had always been a weight he had avoided, a concept too heavy to bear. But now, as he sat amidst the recovering passengers, Keanu realized that the greatest challenge wasn't the entity he had faced. It was the challenge of living with the knowledge of his own potential. The responsibility to use his abilities, not for personal gain, but for something greater. His eyes flicked around the cabin, taking in the subdued expressions of the passengers, all of them processing the events in their own way. Some had returned to their seats, looking out the windows with a distant gaze, as if trying to come to terms with what they had just experienced. Others huddled together, whispering in hushed tones, seeking comfort in numbers. Keanu couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. He hadn't asked for any of this. He hadn't asked to be thrust into this role of protector. He had simply been born with these abilities, cursed or gifted, depending on how one chose to view it. The flight attendant, who had been a silent observer throughout the encounter, now approached Keanu cautiously, her eyes wide with apprehension. She hesitated for a moment, her voice barely a whisper. Are you all right?" she asked, her hands trembling. Keanu offered a faint smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm fine," he replied, though he wasn't sure if he was lying to her or to himself. The attendant nodded slowly, her gaze drifting toward the other passengers. I don't know how to thank you. We were all so scared." Keanu's gaze softened as he met her eyes. "You don't need to thank me. You're safe now." But as he spoke the words, he realized they were incomplete. They were true, yes, everyone on the plane was safe. But safety in this context felt temporary. The darkness, whether in the form of supernatural entities or the fears buried deep within people, would always return. It was only a matter of time. And when it did, who would be there to stand in its way? The answer was simple. Keanu would be. He had no choice. He was the protector, the reluctant hero, and he would face the darkness again and again, no matter the cost. The battle was not over, and perhaps it never would be. But Keanu was ready for it, not just for the passengers, not just for the world, but for himself. He wasn't just fighting to save others. He was fighting to redeem himself, to rise above the dark history that had once bound him. He was fighting to prove that, despite his past, he was capable of something greater. And as the plane continued its journey, Keanu sat back, feeling the weight of responsibility settle over him once again. The darkness was always there, waiting to strike, but so long as he had the strength to fight, he would stand against it. There was no turning back now. Keanu's gaze fixed on the horizon as the plane finally descended into its destination, the terror and the adrenaline of the battle now fading into the background. The passengers had mostly quieted, their fears masked by the dull hum of the engines and the anticipation of returning to normal life. But for Keanu, normalcy had shifted irreparably. The supernatural had collided with the real world, and the veil that separated them had been torn. His sense of purpose had solidified in those final moments, the need to protect, to lead, and to embrace the burden of his abilities, not as a curse, but as a call to action. Yet, despite the victory, something gnawed at him, a quiet voice within whispering doubts. Was it enough? Had he truly saved them, or was this just a temporary reprieve? He knew that the entity they had faced was only a fragment of the darkness that lurked in the unseen corners of existence. There were forces at play far beyond human understanding, and though he had won this battle, the war was far from over. The darkness wasn't an external enemy, it lived inside of him too. The battle had mirrored the fight within his own soul. The remnants of his troubled past, his guilt, his inability to fully reconcile with the power he possessed, still lingered like an unresolved wound. But as the plane finally touched down on the tarmac, Keanu's resolve hardened. He wasn't going to run anymore. He wasn't going to hide in the shadows of his own fears and regrets. His powers had never been something he could discard. They were a part of him, and if they were to be used, they would be used with purpose. The passengers began to shuffle toward the exit, their faces pale but relieved, eyes still wide with disbelief. Keanu could hear them whispering among themselves, recounting what they had witnessed, piecing together the surreal moments that had occurred. Some of them still didn't fully understand what had happened, but they knew one thing for sure: they were alive because of him. Keanu's role as the unsung protector had become their unspoken truth. The gratitude was there, palpable, even though it was never voiced directly. He stayed seated a little longer, watching as the cabin emptied. The flight attendants gave him cautious glances, their expressions softening when their eyes met his. No one spoke about the supernatural entity, the terror that had plagued them, but the acknowledgement of what Keanu had done was present in their quiet respect. They knew he had faced something beyond their comprehension, something they would never speak of again, but they also knew he had saved them. It was a shared understanding that existed without words. Keanu eventually stood up, his legs stiff from sitting for so long. The rush of the event had faded, but his mind remained on edge, the weight of what he had done pressing on his shoulders. His decision to step into the role of a protector had never been a conscious one. It had been thrust upon him. But now, in the aftermath, he realized that he couldn't shy away from it. There was no returning to a normal life. The life he had known before had disintegrated the moment he had faced the entity. He had seen the truth about himself. His power was not a gift he could turn on and off, it was a part of his identity. And if he truly wanted to make amends for his past, he would need to learn to embrace that part of himself. As he stepped off the plane, the cool air hit him like a shock to the system. It was grounding, a reminder that the world outside continued to spin, indifferent to the events that had just transpired in the sky. The airport was bustling with activity, the usual rush of passengers, the security checkpoints, and the hum of public transportation. Life was continuing, and in that moment, Keanu knew that while he had been in the eye of the storm would return. It always did. He made his way through the terminal, passing by families, business travelers, and weary tourists, but no one knew the truth of what had happened. The truth of what he had done. His own mind kept replaying the battle over and over again, the moment the entity had materialized, the crushing weight of its presence, and the power he had unleashed to banish it. He could still feel the burn of the spectral energy, the way it had collided with his own essence, as if testing the limits of his power. It had been a moment of reckoning, both for the world and for himself. He couldn't shake the realization that his actions had set something in motion, a chain of events that would lead him down a path from which there was no turning back. Keanu knew that this wasn't just about saving a plane of passengers, it was about the rest of the world. It was about facing the darkness that would always exist, not just outside, but within. He could no longer avoid the mantle of leadership. He had the power, and with it came responsibility. And it was time to start embracing that responsibility, not just for his own redemption, but for the safety of others. Walking out into the bright daylight, Keanu felt a heavy sense of clarity wash over him. The turbulence on the plane had been a mirror of his inner turmoil, a reflection of his struggle to come to terms with his purpose. But now, there was no room for doubt. The path ahead would be fraught with challenges, but Keanu was ready. He wasn't just going to wait for the darkness to return, he was going to face it head on. With every battle, he would learn more about himself, about his abilities, and about the world he had tried to shut out for so long. His past would always be a part of him, he could never escape it. But as he stood at the edge of the terminal, the sun setting in the distance, Keanu realized that he was no longer the man he had been. He was someone new, someone stronger, someone capable of making a difference. He had stepped into the unknown, and he would keep stepping forward. There was no turning back. The legacy of his actions, the choices he made now, would define him, not as a reluctant hero, but as the protector the world needed. With the weight of his newfound purpose heavy on his shoulders, Keanu turned away from the airport, ready to face whatever lay ahead. The darkness was always there, but so was the light. And for the first time in years, Keanu was willing to step into it, no matter the cost. The fight was just beginning.